we can jump into that then. All right. What's up, everybody? I'm Will.
I'm Parker.
Okay, so Parker, I know you've been reading a book about evolutionary psychology, and that's been something you've been interested in recently. And just with like the topic of today being in general kind of like men and women, I'm curious in terms of evolutionary psychology, what are like the main differences that stick out to you between men and women?
Cool. Yeah, so I'll start off by taking a huge shout out to the book that I've been reading, The Ape That Understood the Universe by Stephen Stewart Williams. So a lot of this is not my original thought. It's what I've been learning about recently. So when we begin this conversation, we need to begin by understanding that sex differences in people are also replicated in other species. So if we're trying to figure out kind of what the general sex differences are, a good place to start is to look at other species. So when we begin to look at other species, there's like a couple different things that are really consistently different, right? So one of them being size. So the men in most species are much larger than the women, right? So that's one general thing that's different. There's a couple other things that are consistently different, such as sex drive. The women usually will spend more time taking care of the children. This is all generalizing over broad numbers of species rather than specifying, because there are some species, such as seahorses, where the men have the children rather than vice versa. Um, and then the women are usually choosier about their mates as well. Which is like, so if you look at like peacocks, for example, the men will actually have more of the prettier features, as one may say. So they're the ones with the big tails that are super super pretty, super aesthetic. And so the women then find the men with the prettiest tails, and those are the ones that get selected. um, so that's a pretty interesting thing. But if we begin to look at people, we begin to notice very very similar differences. So men are on average larger than women. Men on average have higher sex drive than women. Women often take care of the children, and they're often choosier about their mates. And this is based on polls across the entire world. Um, Overall, both men and women see sex as something possessed by women, and that men attempt to obtain, right? Now, when we actually look at people and we compare people to animals, though, the differences are substantially different. So, for if you look at like elephant seals, for example, the men are substantially bigger. Like I think it's roughly 3 times larger than the females. And if for men, we don't weigh that much. We aren't that much taller than women. So there's a lot more gray in the difference between our two sexes. So I think that's a good place to start, is to understand that in most species, there are lots of really definite things that are different between men and women. But in people, those differences are a bit more gray, but generally we have very similar differences compared to other species.
So, I didn't actually. The elephant seal thing is pretty crazy. Three
I'm not gonna
times.
lie, I don't know if that number is perfect. I probably should have known that off the top of my head, but it's substantial when you compare the size differences between the sexes.
Well, I mean, like looking at like even dogs is a pretty good one. Like Lulu and Huckleberry. Huckleberry is like 20 pounds heavier than she is, which is for their weight. It's like almost gonna be a third bigger, or actually, well, closer to half or like 50% larger. And he's
And
also
men on average are like 20% or so larger.
so obviously we talked about like you kind of generalize just species in general, men and women. What are the noticeable things between humans that like just stand out to you the most, and then what would be the reasons for those on an evolutionary scale?
Yeah, so the biggest thing about humans that changes things is that we have those gray area differences. So things aren't as straightforward as they are in other species, right? So as I mentioned, the peacocks, the men are a lot prettier, at least to us, than the women. The women are usually duller, and so in our species as humans, it's a little bit different in terms of both species are kind of aesthetically altering the other based on their preferences. So a common preference that you may see women have for men is a V taper, where your shoulders are larger than your waist. A common feature that men like to have on a woman would be larger cleavage, or a symmetrical face. And
Oh, could I
the
actually click on this? Because I have one thing that I'd like to throw in. So although the preferred weight of women over time has shifted, sometimes it's skinnier, sometimes it's a little bit more robust. The actual hip to waist ratio, and I'm not sure exactly what the hip ratio actually is, but the ratio of that has actually been basically the same throughout all of human history in terms of preference. So it's not actually about size for at least men. It really is about shape, which I think is interesting.
That is pretty fascinating. And I think it really ties into one of the huge things that's different between men and women, and which is their approach to mating and their approach to sex. Because this is um, really critical in understanding the differences, right? So, as we understand, men in most species, and including humans, don't bear the child. They don't have to, they're not impregnated. We don't have the children. That's women's job. Women get impregnated and they have the children. And oftentimes, the women also take care of the children, right? So, offspring require a lot more energy out of the women than they do out of the men. And I know in our species, the men also do take care of the children, but in the majority of circumstances, the women are much more in the child care role, right? So understanding that women have a much higher, so in terms of them having offspring, their mate choice is substantially more important because if their mate is, for example, has a genetic abnormality and they have a child together and then the man leaves, now the woman is taking care of this child who isn't is a has probably has a little bit of messed up genes, and she doesn't even have a man there to help her raise the child. So this is just very poor in terms of replication of genes. So women have to be choosier, correct? And understanding that women need to be choosier really makes sense in terms of our genetic differences, right? And so something to think about in terms of that is the fact that women are going to look for specific things in men, aside from physical characteristics of just general health, because that's what both species, both men and women, are going to be looking for, are healthy mates to ensure the survival of their offspring, because that is kind of the whole purpose of mating, is to ensure the reproduction of your genes and ensure that you can have the highest quantity of those genes into the world, right? And so in women's case, they need to make sure that their mate is fertile and healthy, so you have healthy mate offspring. And another component that would be pretty important is to make sure that the men are also going to take care of the child to an extent, right? So whether that be genetic or it can be financial or through status, right? So a man who is, for example, a politician, when male politicians rise in power, they get substantial more attention from women. But when women are in the same situation and they rise to power, they don't get substantial attention from men because men's approach to sex and mating is substantially different, right? So men can have a lot more children, right? We are capable of, we can have sex with, let's say, 100 people in a year, and we can have 100 children in 9 months. Women can't do that. They can only have one child in 9 months. So the important of the woman's status in terms of the status being helpful in terms of taking care of the offspring is not as important. What's more important is the fertility of the woman. So that's why fertility is so important in men's choices. As you were referring to just a moment ago, the shape of the woman is more important than the actual size because the shape is a better indicator of fertility. For example, like larger breasts would be better for breastfeeding. Um, or wider hips will be better for birthing. These are just good indicators that this is a fertile person who's ready to have a child. Um, as opposed to maybe someone who's like older and they're just not as in fertile as shape, and so they're going to be less attractive. Something that's really interesting to think about here is that men are most interested in the most fertile women. So a teenage boy is really interested in a 25 or 22-year-old woman because they're in their most fertile state. So that really indicates the differences in like what men and women are trying to get out of the actual mating process.
So, like in that last thing that you said, does that mean, and this might not be something you know off the top of your head, but like, does that mean that um, whenever men are younger and older than the most fertile age of a woman, they're always going to kind of pick between that range, which I think intuitively that makes that's a relatively obvious thing in our society. But does that really end up shaping how kind of the dating pool almost always works? Is just that like 20 to like mid 30 something really always is kind of what is going to be the most at least substantially more attractive women lie in that period?
Yeah, no, that's for sure what the data suggests. There are polls done on just relatively rating attractiveness, and the most fertile women consistently are rated the most attractive across the entire world. And you also look at, for example, this is a silly example, but it's also an accurate and a good telling one. But dating apps, women are most highly selected when they're in a certain age range and they're in their most fertile state. Men are most highly selected when they indicate that they have good status. So when they say, I have a really high paying job, they're much more likely to get matches than if they just said, I go and make sandwiches for a living. So that is just kind of a further indicator of what our human nature is kind of telling us to do. It's telling women to go find a man that's either genetically going to produce phenomenal offspring, or they're going to stick around so they can take care of those children. And men are looking for fertile women to ensure the viability of their offspring. But when it comes to general sex, it's a lot different because men are looking, at least in our ancestors and historically, are looking to have oftentimes a lots of children because obviously the more children you have, the more likely those genes are to continue to exist. But for women, they need to ensure the survival of the few children they have because they can't have as many.
So, is there any sort of like typical age range? Obviously, for women, I think it's easier to like label that because of the fertility window and everything. But is there any sort of like typical age range that you see that like men are considered the most attractive that they can be, or is it much more aligned with just like where you are in a certain period of your life in terms of obviously like status, like we're talking about?
So I definitely think status is the most important part of that. In terms of age range, I don't think there really is like kind of a cutoff. I have kind of a silly example. The lead artist or lead singer for the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Anthony Kiedis, is currently in a relationship with a 20-year-old, and he's 60 years old. So there's clearly like the indication of, oh, Anthony Kiedis has lots of status as the lead singer of one of the most popular bands that's ever existed, and then this woman's 20-year-old and her fertile period. So that's just kind of how the general attraction would work. When you also take a look at to like the oldest man to ever have a child was 96. The oldest woman to ever have a child was 69. So substantial differences. That's literally like 30 years difference in when men are still capable of having children and women are just kind of beyond their fertile phases.
Um, that actually is crazy. 96 is wild.
It's
Um,
unbelievable.
so I guess something that I would be curious about now, and if you have other things that you want to talk about first, I'm down. But is we're talking about the fact that it's beneficial for the survival of the gene to have as many children as you can, especially as a man. So why is it that? And I know that I think 80 like 7% of societies throughout human history have actually been um, they have not been monogamous. But why is it that in successful, whatever that means, long lasting, successful societies, is there an evolutionary reason that, monogamy would have existed?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So when we begin to look at monogamy, it makes a lot of sense for a number of reasons. One, so because people are more in that gray range, men aren't automatically going to have as many children as they possibly can, right? So we're also interested in child care. In like most species across the globe, men do some of the childcare, and some of them they do most, but that is extraordinarily rare. In the most cases, it is the women doing more of the childcare. So, in terms of monogamy, it does a couple of things. One, the father has a lot more control over the survival of their offspring because they're around to make sure that they, um, are healthy and safe. And then for the women, well, it's a couple of things. One, if they're only in one relationship, they know who the father of their child is. So they know the status of the individual who has the genes that are in the child that they bared. And if they were to have sex with tons of people and they still had like maybe someone who would pay for their child's, actually that's kind of a poor example. I'm not going to get on that tangent, but it makes a lot of sense because it really increases the survivability of your offspring because you know the genetic coding of them. But the even biggest thing, or even more important thing for women, is that if they're in a monogamous relationship where the man is staying around to take care of the child, that removes a lot of the chances of like maybe the wife runs into some health problem and can't take care of the children. Okay, but the husband's right there to take care of them. So monogamy is actually really important for both species. I'm sorry, for both sexes in that regard. The men have a much higher chance of ensuring the survival of their offspring. They have a lot more control over how those offspring will end up because they're doing more of the nurture process. So they can just even further promote the continuation of their gene pool. And then women are ensuring that their mate is going to stay around to do some of that nurturing. And provide either status to help their children be successful early in their lives or financial freedom of any sort. And then they're also, both parties in the relationship are certain that their genes are the ones in the offspring that they're taking care of. And what's interesting kind of is like when you look at relatives of people, so people are really interested in promoting the gene pool, their gene pool. So they're going to also be more willing to take care of their relatives than they would their neighbors. It's similar here because that's their gene pool. They're trying to, not every single thing an organism does is to promote the survival of its gene pool. I mean, we go to a comedy club. That's not, we're just going to have a good time. But the overall goal of our genes is to promote the survival and the continuation of their genes.
So I guess something that I would be like interested in is I mean, I obviously hold up. I have one thing before I say that actually, which is that I would imagine that monogamy is also very beneficial for men because it ensures that their genes are the ones that are being reproduced.
Yeah.
Uh, and obviously that just is kind of, it's unfortunate if you end up in a situation where you're spending time, energy, and resources, especially on a scale tens, hundreds of thousands of years ago, to raise and to support somebody else's child. That's a pretty brutal realization.
Hmm.
I guess something I would be curious about now is, so how does the culture have any impact on how these things function, or is the culture more impacted by the actual evolution and by the genome itself? Which one is more influential, or not even which one is more influential, but what is kind of the relationship between society and culture and the evolutionary, the genome?
Yeah, so there's nature, there's what is in our genes, what our genes are telling us to do, and then there's nurture. So what our culture and our relatives and those who raise us are telling us to do. Those are absolutely substantially different powers on controlling how one views their life and one lives their life out. In actual nature, like with organisms, there's very little, well, I mean, there's no culture. So they're living pretty much exactly as their genes would tell them to. Maybe there's the occasional thing that their parents taught them, but the majority of that is just what their genes are telling them to do. Um, in humans case it's so much different because we have a culture that puts certain stigmas, certain dogma, certain ideology in our brains about how people should be. And sometimes it'll tie into our human nature and other times it's going very far against it. um, So for example, in our modern time with the technology that we have in terms of contraception, sex is a completely different ballgame because you're not always under the impression, maybe not impression, you're not always under the risk of having offspring because you can protect from that. So therefore, women are now have a way different role in the sex game, and they're open to having casual sex because they don't automatically have to go have a child after having sex. So this completely changes modern people's approach to the dating and mating pool, and we haven't evolved for this. Our evolution has made us so where men are meant to have as many offspring as they can and ensure the survival of those offspring. Women are meant to have, I mean, it's the same game, but obviously it's less offspring, so it's a slightly different approach. Now, women can do the same task that would usually result in that offspring and not have to bear that burden. So, because of this complete and utter shift in how um, sex is approached, we have complete changes in how dating works, how the sexes view relationships, and it's making the differences between men and women more and more gray because women are having the capability to go do the things that men are usually capable of, in terms of just having casual sex. Um, and then this also kind of opens the doors for women to be more independent, and go, work their own wage, have their own jobs. They can still have casual relationships and they don't have to worry about having children afterwards. So this complete shift in our approach to sex is not what we're evolved to do. And I think it's really interesting when we begin to think about how, what is our nature in terms of sex? Like, how are we built in terms of sex? And I think I'd like to turn this over to you. I'd like to ask you, what are the differences that we see in men and women in terms of strictly having sex?
Well, I think a good way to kind of start the topic is because you're talking about contraception is to kind of broadly categorize what we're mainly talking about here, which is not really going to be the IUDs or anything like that. It's going to mostly be hormonal birth control, specifically like the pill, which was introduced in the 70s. And there's a few things that we can look at with the pill, which is that one, obviously, like you're talking about, it eliminates a lot of the risk and it also promotes a lot of what the benefits of the feminist movement were, which is more economic opportunity. You have a higher chance of being able to be in school because you don't have the risk of having children. Lots of positive things have come from hormonal birth control. But what you also see is kind of what you're talking about, which is that this is not a part of our nature. This is something that goes almost it's almost the antithesis to our nature. It's opposite. And so some of the causes, or I think maybe it would be beneficial to kind of explain what the hormonal birth control is actually doing beforehand, which is I'll give a brief explanation of it, which is you have the main sex hormones in men and women are different. Men have testosterone, women have estrogen. That's obviously like, okay, we have both, but you know what I mean? Like those are the main sex hormones in each gender. And the main parts of that with hormonal birth control is the menstrual cycle for women is a very, very, very important thing, not just for the actual health and stability of the woman, but also for the way that they date and the way that men perceive them. And so you have this menstrual cycle that's pretty complicated, and it's all about the fact that you're producing these eggs, and you're trying to be ready to be fertile, and then you also have a cycle, or part of the cycle, which is like preparing itself to have a child. And so the way that hormonal birth control works is it has a massive increase in progesterone in the brain, which, so to give a quick explanation, you have estradiol, estrogen, progesterone, and estrogen. So estradiol is the main like sex hormone in women. It makes them more prone to wanting to have sex. It actually increases. There was a study done recently that shows that they on with high estradiol, they enjoy things like music more. It makes them more open to experiences that may include sex. They're probably going to be more interested in things like working out and behaving in flirty ways. and then like also men respond differently to them when they're in this period. So you have fertile women and then you have another stage of the menstrual cycle, which is kind of the preparation in case of impregnation or if they have been impregnated, which is the increase of progesterone. Now, what that does is it makes them sleepier, it makes them hungrier, it makes them way less interested in sexual activity, it makes them less interested in just men in general, not even on a sexual level. It's just they don't particularly even want to be around a lot of men. And hormonal birth control, it sticks them in this phase of high progesterone. And so it's almost tricking their brain into always thinking that they're like about to be pregnant. And so they're not supposed to be fertile anymore. Um, and that has a lot of impacts on what the dating market looks like and how men and women interact. And I think your actual question was the actual differences of sex between men and women, especially with birth control. And to touch on like the nature of the difference of sex, the main like clear obvious differences are like the ones you're talking about. The way that men approach sex is much more you know I'm going to have sex with lots of different women, and I'm going to have, and sex in general is just a less important like task. It's more of a stimulation. It's more of a just response to a sex drive. Whereas for women, it's much more an act of like trust and relationship status and commitment.
Yeah, something really interesting to think about there is just the orgasm. So when men orgasm, they spread their seed. That's what happens. When women orgasm, they're not increasing the likelihood of their offspring. So this is something else that kind of ties into it. So they have this orgasm, which is likely a byproduct of just being a human being, just as men have nipples, which is just a byproduct of being, an embryo and kind of being in that initial phase of not actually one sex or the other. Um, so there's still byproducts and there's still that gray area of like both men and women can have orgasms, but the significance of it is substantially different. When women have the orgasm, it's I believe that's when they release. I actually, let me turn this on you. So I know that when women have an orgasm, it's a lot different in terms of the actual chemicals that are released in their brain as opposed to men. So I would love to better understand what the differences between this chemical release is, especially considering that men having an orgasm does actually increase the chances of having offspring, and in women's cases, it doesn't.
Yeah, no, I mean, the differences in the orgasm are pretty funny in terms of like almost functionality, because I think it is a very clear indication of what the actual sex is for the organism, which is that, like you said, for men, having an orgasm is I am releasing my genome, I am trying to have more children, whereas for women, it much more is about the actual relationship and the social dynamic between the two people. And so we can really clearly see this with the actual hormones that are being released with sex. So men do have an oxytocin spike whenever they have an orgasm, but it's not very substantial, which is why a lot of people will talk about the fact that like the male orgasm is way less intense than the female orgasm. And one of the reasons it's almost just like a completion reward. It's like okay, you did the thing you're supposed to do. Like now you're gonna get a quick rush of dopamine and you're gonna feel good real quick, and a little bit of oxytocin. Where women, their orgasm has a massive flood of oxytocin, and which is a bonding chemical. It's actually the exact same chemical they release whenever they give birth. Like right when they give birth, they have a massive flood of oxytocin. So this chemical is made for bonding. It is okay. I have trusted you to like have sex with me. I'm now, that means to some degree I am trusting your ability to be a father. I am trusting your ability to provide. I am trusting your ability to protect. I'm trusting your ability to be committed to me. And so because of that, the chemical I am now I am releasing is a bonding chemical. Whereas men don't have that bonding chemical when they're having sex. Not saying that you can't bond with men during sex, but it's not what sex is for men. Whereas for women, a lot of it is bonding. A lot of it is kind of that relationship status, which is why you see in a lot of modern relationships, if the men are emotionally unavailable and not particularly there for the women don't have much of a sex drive because the actual relationship itself is extremely important to the sex drive of a woman. Whereas for a man, it is just essentially stimulation. It's like, okay, I see a rock. That rock looks like a pair of boobs. Now I'm ready to go. Like, and so it's just substantially different in the actual importance of what the act is. And it really just kind of boils down to what you were talking about originally, which is just sex for women carries a way higher risk than it does for men. And so the risk associated with it means that the reasons for doing it have to be different.
So it's really interesting that you say that women have this high release of this bonding chemical oxytocin, and that men don't have as much of a release of that. So if men aren't really using that chemical to bond with their significant other, how are men bonding with anyone?
So the main bonding chemicals in women and men are still it's oxytocin. Now again, men do have oxytocin. I'm not like it's not that they don't have it. It's just substantially less, or at least it's substantially less important. And so what men have is they have vasopressin, and vasopressin is actually an older neurotransmitter. At least in mammals, it's significantly older. And so vasopressin, which again, as soon as we start saying these things, it starts to intuitively make a lot of sense for a lot of people, which is that men don't bond over things like sharing emotions, which is what women, you get a release of oxytocin. Like if you and me were sharing a story, you know, and while you're telling me your story, I'm like, oh my goodness, like that sounds hard. That sounds rough. Like, how did you handle that? Like, that is a way that you can have a bonding. And again, that it's not like that's not bonding for men. It's just not the main thing. For women, that releases oxytocin. They bond to each other, whether it be with a man or whether it would be with other women. Men, that vasopressin, the difference is it's usually released in like two ways, which is essentially either overcoming an obstacle and achieving a goal, or it's teaching, which, if you really think about it, makes a lot of sense because whenever men bond, it's very often on something like, especially in a younger age, it's on something like a sports team where there's always some sort of obstacle to be achieved or to be overcome. It's okay, we're going to beat this team. And even though I don't like you necessarily when we're on the team together, now that we've achieved this goal together, like now that we've beat the opponent, now we're friends. Now we're close. Now, now we're boys. Let's rah. Let's go, hunt and kill this animal together. You know, so that it makes a lot of sense. And then the teaching thing I think is really interesting because if you think about the way that men usually bond specifically with their sons, it's often about kind of this almost this I'm here in terms of the amount of information and wisdom I have. And because you are now learning these things, I want you to come to me and I want you to be questioning what my opinion is about these things because I want to tell you, I want to share this with you. I want to essentially I think that you are deserving of me bestowing information, and which is essentially, if you really want to boil it down into something else other than just like me teaching, the information that I have um, has been achieved through time, energy, and effort. And so, because of that, I am essentially bestowing upon you my time, energy, and effort with teaching you the things that I know. And so, that's a massive difference in the way that men and women bond.
That's really interesting to know because that sharing of information will also really increase the survival of that offspring, um, as opposed to like women who would be more interested in the bonding side of things, which maybe fostering that relationship in terms of having like emotional stability is a higher increase of survival of their offspring because it's not that they need to know how to go fight a cougar, but they need to know how to bond and relate to their peers. Um, and those two differences are pretty substantial. So if men are bonding through teaching and working together and like going for a goal, and then women are bonding through emotional compassion and truly trying to understand one another, I I wonder if that could have some grand effects on how men and women try to bond as opposed to like intersex bonding, or sorry, as opposed to intrasex bonding, intersex bonding, when you have true building of the relationship between a man and a woman. So I was curious if you think that, or how do you think the two differences in the bonding strategies can come into play when it comes to men and women?
Yeah, no, I mean, so that's a great question, and I think it perfectly kind of not sums up because it's obviously a lot more complicated than just this, but I think that right there would be a great starting point to kind of give an example on why we're experiencing a sex and dating crisis, which is that, less men and women are having sex than really ever before, and relationships, and specifically just the culture around relationships, seems to be in a pretty rough spot right now. I think a lot of that comes to the fact that we bond differently. And so, for instance, and this is I think this is a story we can literally all relate to, whether it be as a man or as a woman with a friend or like whatever it be. I think everyone can understand this exact scenario, which is, a woman has a hard day at work or at school, or just, and maybe she had a hard day taking care of the kids. They were rambunctious, and it was just a hard day. Whenever the man comes home from work or whatever it may be, she wants to talk to him. She wants to say, this is what my day was like. This is what happened. These are the things that I have experienced. And she's looking for someone that can connect with her on an emotional level that says, like, wow, like we were just talking about, like those experiences sound difficult. Like, and they want to be like asked, like, okay, so what did you do with that? Like, if Jessica said this, like, how did you respond? It's kind of this, it's this typical, it's exactly how we kind of intuitively see the way that men and women bond. But whenever a woman tries to do that to a man, because of the way that we function and because of the fact that we're problem solvers, that's the way that we bond, and it's the way that our brains work in terms of thinking. Whenever a woman is telling us about things that are hard, or a man is telling us about things that are hard, our initial reaction is to say something like, okay, well, like, or even just thought processes, okay, so what can we do to fix this? Like, if there's a problem at hand, we need to solve the problem. But to women, especially in that circumstance that I'm laying out, they don't want the man to solve the problem. In fact, they probably already know what the answer to the problem is. It's just that they are trying to bond and share an emotional experience. It's a vulnerability, essentially. And men, we're not interpreting that as a bonding experience. We're interpreting it as a way that we can bond, which is to problem solve. And so, even though we're both trying to achieve the same goal of bonding, we're just approaching it in such different ways that it causes strife. Because whenever my girlfriend comes in and is kind of talking about her day and the rough experiences she has, whenever I solve that problem for her, what it actually tells her is, like, I don't care about what you're talking about. Like, let's just finish the conversation and then go over there and leave me alone. Like, that's essentially what they're hearing. And that's not actually what they're hearing, but like, that's a lot of what's being interpreted. Whereas for men, we're sitting here and we're like, oh, great. Like, I just solved her problem. Like, I feel so good, and it's just a completely different thing. The same way that whenever a man like shares something that's been emotionally difficult or something like that with a woman, often what he's looking for is literally just like a quick kind of reaction, or or her asking him how he managed to solve that problem. Whereas often women are going to respond in a way that makes more sense for other women, which is to show some level of empathy, which is like, oh, that sounds really difficult. And a man, very often, it will like kind of push back against that, and it's like, no, 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 like, I'm fine. Everything's fine. I'm good. Don't worry. I'm just trying to tell you. Um, and so I think that just the simple difference in the vasopressin and the oxytocin, the ways that we bond like that, I think it shows a lot of the reason that we're having so many issues in the modern dating market.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty clear to me that if both sexes are approaching, this same common ground of trying to bond with one another, but we do it so differently, this could cause so many difficulties in communicating. Because while, we may be trying to kind of solve the same, or not solve, but accomplish the same goal, an analogy that we've used before that I like is, if we're on a basketball team and I'm the scorer and you're the rebounder, and suddenly we go out one game, instead of me trying to score and you trying to rebound, I try to rebound and you try to score. We're doing things incorrectly. So the scorer needs to kind of, can I even use this properly? I don't think this relates well enough. Well, okay, I'm not gonna stick to this analogy. I don't think I can apply it well enough. Um, but
I
something
think
I would.
though is that just like there's a broader goal that's trying to be achieved, which is like win the game or bond, and it's just that we are doing opposite things to do that. Um,
Yeah.
and so
The only
because of that,
reason I think it's not comparable is because like the scorer and rebounder can't find a middle ground where they relate. They have
yeah,
to still do their individual things. That's why I was like, oh crap, that doesn't actually, because they still need to stay in their categories. But with men and women, it's less that they need to at least the way I'm interpreting it, is it's less that they need to be like staying in their categories, but rather attempting to understand where the other person's coming from. So, in that context, do you think it's possible that mansplaining is a product of lack of understanding of where the man's coming from?
Oh, the majority of the time, I would assume. So the thing is with mansplaining specifically is, and before I actually go into like what this is, I would like to clarify if a guy is like almost treating you like a child, or he's like trying to explain something that seems so obvious and he's kind of being a jerk about it, he's being a jerk. Like he's not like that's just how it is. Not every time, but like a lot of interpret it as that. But if he's actually just trying to teach you something, even as another man, often it kind of come off as this like, especially if it's something simple, it's like, dude, I already know this. But the thing
Mm-hmm.
is, whenever he's doing that with other men, like if I start to tell you something, and you know what that is, you're often gonna be like, oh, dude, I already know this, and we're almost just gonna skip forward to the next thing. And so I'm like, okay, you know that, so you already have the base, so I can move on. Whereas that's not how women usually communicate with each other. And so they're like, oh, why is he like? Does he think I'm a child? Like, why does he not respect me enough? Why does he feel the need to try to like teach me this? When in reality, it's just that I have this information and I want to give it to you. Like I want to share this piece of all this time and energy and effort that I've spent like acquiring this information, and I want to give it to you. And so again, it's just like a failure of theory of mind. It's just that whenever we're communicating, even though we are trying to do the same things, we are not actually communicating about the fact that we're doing it differently. And so a lot of this can just simply be solved by, just to use the example again of like the girlfriend telling her boyfriend about a hard day. A lot of this can be solved with something as simple as the man saying, "Look, honey, before we start talking about this, I would like to know, are you like telling me this because there is an issue or a problem that you think I could help you solve? Or are you telling me this just because you want to talk to me about how your day was?" And something as simple as that clears up so much, because now the man is just going, if she says it's an issue and I want to help you, I want your help solving it, then he can go full man mode and be like, okay, man, like, what are we going to do about this? Let's figure out a solution. But if it's not that, then he can take a step back and just go, okay, like, what's your story? Okay, interesting. Like how is this affecting you? Like what's going on? I think that clears up a lot of it. And then from the women's side, having um, these kind of more goal-oriented activities, even actually as an example during sex, because men are kind of more goal-oriented, whereas women are more emotional bonded, they have that emotional bonding through having an orgasm, like we talked about, whereas men don't. But if a woman is like giving the guy cues and goals almost, it's like, okay, I want you to do this. I don't want you to do that. I want you to do this again. I want you like having that actual communication, it incites the bonding that happens. And so if you do that during sex and other activities as well, I just think sex is a good example. It actually will it will allow that bonding to take place, because it's just a misunderstanding of what we're both going for. And the women might be thinking, especially during a sexual context, like, well, I don't want to tell him that I'm not enjoying this, or I don't want to tell him that I'd rather do this instead. I don't want to like put that stressor on him. When in reality, putting that stressor on him is how you bond to him. And so or how he bonds to you. And so it's a super interesting misunderstanding, because it's even people who try to communicate effectively, so much of it is just a failure of theory of the mind, which is that we just don't actually understand what the other person is doing, because we're like, oh, like they're trying to bond with me right now. They want us to solve them, or they want us to solve a problem for them. No, they want to talk to us. Or, oh, like, what is he doing? Like, why is he talking to me like this? Like, he thinks I don't know? No, he's trying to teach you something, because it's how he bonds. Like, most of these things just come down to a fact that there's just a misunderstanding of how men and women communicate. And a lot of it can just be fleshed out by actually communicating what the other person is trying to do. So as a man, if you're like, hey, I don't want to like, I don't want to, interject or something, but this is something I know a good amount about, and I'd be interested to tell you about it. And they're like, well, I'm not really interested in hearing that much. I don't particularly care that much. And you're like, okay, cool, like whatever. Or, yeah, no, I would like to hear about this. And so much of this can be just communicated in the sense of what you were actually trying to do. And I think so much of that is just ignored, because frankly, it seems kind of weird. It doesn't really function a lot of times very well in like what a clean social interaction is. And I think we just need to get over that, because the communication is just a more important thing. Um, So yeah, I think that's kind of the mansplaining thing on a long-winded way.
No, that's really cool to think about and ponder the differences in how we're approaching the same thing, just in terms of general communication. And I do like to think about in terms of, you know, whenever I get really passionate about something around my, women friends, depending on who they are, it can go in a couple of ways. And some women, I feel as if I'll begin to explain and they'll kind of check out and just not really care. And they're just like, like, why are you kind of dumbing this down? Not only do I not care, but you're kind of explaining it in a way that it like removes the intellect from the other individual. But if I were to be as simple as to say, hey, this is something super cool. Do you really want to do you care about hearing from this? Well, I think it does a lot of things. One, now we both understand what I'm trying to do. And two, the woman, whether or not she even cares, she knows what I'm trying to do. So she may just sit there, look pretty, and then just like smile at me and say, "Hey," or just be like excited that I'm passionate. Just be excited that I'm like excited. Not even like caring about the information, but just being excited to do something that would make the other happy. And then obviously it goes vice versa. If the woman goes, "Hey, I just want you to listen to me about this," and then the man just sits there and I just listen and I just tell you, wow, I mean, it's not that I am in your shoes, but that's a really difficult situation. And no one likes to have that, instance occur. And maybe it's like some drama they have with their friends. And you're like, yeah, Becky's kind of a bitch, if we're being honest, like just a little bit. And then you both bond over that little fact instead of being like, oh, you need to change how you interact with Becky. Oh, you need to cut Becky off. Just kind of trying to understand. And if we both just kind of, if both men and women began to understand where the other one was coming from, it would just be so much different in terms of our ability to communicate. So I do wonder if generally, trying to kind of break down the communication between the sexes and understand that we're different in terms of what we're trying to get out of the conversation would help us communicate. I wonder if some of those hormonal treatments that we're using for contraception, if they're, really altering the way that people are mating or going about relationships. Um, I wonder if that change from the hormone in terms of women's way of communication, and then therefore men's response in terms of they also change how they communicate. I wonder if those changes in communication can have larger downstream effects, like, our current tendency to push kind of away from monogamy, because that's less common nowadays. Casual sex is much more common. So it really changes the way that people are bonding just in general. So I do wonder if those hormonal differences could be at play here in terms of causing some of this dating crisis.
Yeah, so I mean, I absolutely think so, and I'm gonna throw these are somewhat unrelated statistics, but I want to toss them out there because I think they're legitimately just wild. I mean, I think it gives a good basis of kind of what we're gonna be talking about, which is that women on birth control show to have 130% increase in depression, and there's 65% of women are on birth control between the ages of 18 and 49. Uh, Now, just to get into kind of the men and women interacting strangely kind of thing. Um, what it really boils down to is that when women are on birth control, their hormones are obviously different and they're in a stage where that estradiol has been lowered. And estradiol appears to be something that's very important in choosing a quote unquote like typically masculine male. It seems to kind of drive them towards this. In fact, they even did studies with women who were like bisexual, and whenever they got off the pill, they almost um a lot of them actually ended up being kind of exclusively heterosexual, which is really interesting. Uh, and I don't actually know, I can't remember exactly what that study was. I will look to find it because it is interesting. But a lot of this is that if women's hormones are different in terms of what they're like, how they're approaching a mate, they're going to have different things that are, standing out to them. And so there's been lots of studies done on the fertility of men and women and how they relate to each other. And for instance, women, when they are on birth control, They did studies that track the masculinity of like, the typically masculine traits of faces, levels of testosterone, and just like typically masculine personalities. And women off of birth control prefer all of these things, whereas women on birth control, they choose men who have, typically less masculine faces. They choose men who are um, lower testosterone and have like just less masculine personalities. And what this also is doing is because men are the ones who fit the standard that women are setting, it's also causing kind of this loop that's feeding into itself. So you have women on birth control that kind of prefer less masculine men, and then you have the fact that less masculine, or like because of the women being less fertile, you're also making men less masculine, at least in some sense, because they're not around fertile women. And so it's kind of this self-feeding cycle, which is women are less fertile, so men are, less typically masculine, and then women like the typically less masculine men. But something that you see, and that, that none of that is really an issue, except for the fact that what we see is that women that are on birth control with a partner, whenever they come off of birth control, a lot of times what happens is they're no longer attracted to their partner. And we can all sit here and pretend that sexual attraction and desire is somehow not important for a relationship, but it is. It's very important for a healthy relationship. And so, if you have these women that are dating these men that are less masculine, and then they get off their birth control and they're no longer attracted to their partner, you have a massive issue with how relationships are being formed, because the actual innate desires of the person are almost being, dampened by these hormonal drugs. Now, I'm not exactly sure how that is affecting the actual dating market itself in terms of a statistical way. I think it's a pretty intuitive thing, which is that, if women like men that are less masculine, men are going to slowly become less typically masculine, as well as the fact that you kind of have this cultural shift of graying the areas. You're talking about the fact the areas are already kind of gray, and you have this cultural shift to make it seem as though there aren't any differences, and that, at least what I think is going on right now is that you have women becoming masculated and men becoming effeminized, which is that masculinized and feminized, which is that women are being told in a quick like quip almost to have sex like their brother and to work like their father. They're supposed to have careers and full-time jobs and all this, and that's what their life goal should be, and that they should have as sex with as many people as they want to, and that number can be as high as you'd like, and it won't really matter, because we're almost trying to remove the emotion from sex for women, which we already talked about with the hormones, the bonding hormones. You can't do. Uh, and then for men, or I think that men are being kind of, it's not even feminized. It's just we're being sedated. We're being told, you shouldn't, especially in schools, you shouldn't have a problem sitting still. You shouldn't be rambunctious. You shouldn't want to, if there's a tower of blocks standing up, you shouldn't want to go knock that down, stuff like that. And so you're having this gray area that's also being increased by these hormonal birth control, because it's making the differences stand out even less because of the actual response to fertility, where we already know, for instance, men's testosterone has dropped 1% since 1980. And we know that if you put men in a room and like vent in smells, they respond to the smell of a more fertile woman. They respond to the silhouette of a woman walking who is more fertile. They respond to all of these things that are signs of fertility. And so by dampening the fertility of women, it's also possible that that's making a even larger impact on the fact that we have this gray area between men and women.
Wow, so it does seem that we're kind of making the sex differences obsolete to an extent, or at least culturally, not physiologically, obviously. And due to the cultural changes, since we're both gray and we're all in these temporary states of attraction, specifically with women that are on hormonal birth control, who are having children later in their life, so they're experiencing substantially more menstrual cycles, and they're not breastfeeding for as long. They're doing many things that are just so much different than they used to be, not that long ago. I mean, think about it. All of the contraception and stuff has occurred in the last, what, like 70, 80 years?
I mean, specifically for the hormonal stuff, like the pill, came out relatively around the 70s. But I think something that I didn't really wrap it up the correct way, which is essentially that we have these innate differences that do exist. Like
There,
it's not about the fact that you don't. No, and I know that you, because like the evolutionary thing, you covered that pretty clearly. I was just saying you have these innate differences that 110% exist, and because of the culture trying to almost override these, and I think it's more obvious with women, because it's almost like, hey, it's almost this complete shift, because we women were in a lower social place a while ago, like within the last 80 years, and that was not a good thing. And so because we're coming out of that, it's almost kind of trying to shift this pendulum, which is that, well, to be a strong, independent, feminine woman, what you actually have to be masculine. You have to be more disagreeable. You have to be more work oriented. You have to be, you just have to be more, like, I think the disagreeable thing is one of the more obvious things, but we're kind of we're trying to socially remove these boundaries between men and women and make this area of gray be what it just is. Uh, and I think what that's actually doing, though, is I think it's why we have such an increase in depression and anxiety. And I think it's why you can see, not the only reason, obviously. I think it's also why you see a massive issue with sex and dating, which is that both of these people are going against their innate desires. Just as an example, I want if I want someone who's very feminine, who wants to be, wants to have children and wants to support those children while I support the family financially, if that's what I want, and then I'm being told that that's not what I should want, and I should want to, maybe not have kids, and I should want to have a woman who is, entirely independent and all these things. Well, maybe because of the social status that comes along with those things, maybe I'm going to shift, but then I'm not following my actual innate desires. I'm not following that nature. And nurture is definitely important, 100%, but nature is extremely important. And especially the differences that we see in men and women and the way that that plays out in dating. If you have men looking for feminine women, and then being told that maybe that's not really what they should be looking for, and then you have women looking for masculine men, but then being told that that masculinity is bad, and now they're going to be put on birth control, and they're going to be attracted to less masculinity. You have all of these things coming together that have a massive impact on how we behave with each other, because we're not in tune with our nature at all. In fact, I think it's pretty common nowadays to almost, if you talk to people, it seems as though human beings don't actually understand the fact that we're animals, in the same way that in the same way that the elephant seals, or in the same way that the dogs have these innate desires and kind of mating preferences and things like that. That's the same way that we are. We're just a little bit more complicated. And I think
yeah,
that, like, I was just gonna say, by trying to remove ourselves from our nature, we're destroying what that nature produces, which is healthy, stable, lasting relationships.
absolutely. It does seem like what we need to be doing is shifting closer to this monogamous lifestyle that we've been in for such a long period until so recently. Once contraception existed and people didn't have to, like, worry so much about having sex prior to that moment, it was always like, okay, I'm gonna go find my mate, and then we're gonna have a bunch of children, and we're gonna be this family, and our purpose is gonna be taking care of our family, and really being one. So it's definitely really interesting to see those differences, and kind of what would help would be moving back towards this monogamous lifestyle, and kind of identifying some of these differences, because they're not bugs, they're not mistakes. This is how we're meant to feel. We should be interpreting that as such, and taking with that information and doing the best we can with it, with such a strange culture that we currently live in. So would you say that the biggest thing that our culture needs right now to avoid this kind of, at least a lot of the issues in terms of gender, which also would have great downstream effects in other issues, like, for example, for ADHD, we're expecting children to go sit down and stay quiet and, be silent the entire day. That is not how we've always been. 10,000 years ago, all the children are out playing and running the whole time. That's how we're built to be. So just because a kid is feeling, cooped up in their seat, doesn't mean that they have a problem. Just as if men have a higher sex drive, doesn't mean that that's a problem. But what seems to be causing these new problems is this huge change in hormones in half of our populations, and this huge shift in the expectation of the two sexes. So it seems that maybe a shift back in this direction, would you say, is what's most important at the moment for kind of rekindling what it is that we should be doing?
Yeah, I think that it's kind of important to phrase it as a way that it's not that we're going back to, a time where women couldn't vote and that things were not socially equal. It's just a matter of there are fundamental roles that our genders allow us to play that fulfill us and satisfy us. And now again, these are all generalizations, but in general, the man's role has been to provide and protect and sustain, and the woman's role has been to, kind of child rear and then also be a massive benefit to the man's motivation, and also have, like, because of the child rearing, by the way, and this is something I just like to throw out there, every job that has ever existed exists to support the most important job in the world, which is being a mother. Like, every job that has ever existed exists to support that job. And so, being a mother is such an important thing. And obviously, I'm not a woman, so I'm not trying to sit here and understand what that actually is like. But women that, like, it's a fulfilling thing, it's a satisfying thing, it's an important thing, and we're trying to remove that. We're like, oh well, you're a woman who wants to be a stay-at-home mom, like, wow, the internalized misogyny there. And it's like, no, I am a woman who wants to have a wife, or I'm a woman who wants to have a husband and or I mean, or a wife. I don't really care. Like, I'm a woman who wants to have a family, because a family is what ultimately is the production of our genes. It's going back to what you said, but also just in terms of a more social, like, modern thing. It is what appears to be fulfilling. If you look at what women and men were satisfied with throughout the last 100 years, people who have had healthy, stable families with children are the happiest. They're the most fulfilled. They're the most satisfied. Like, it just appears to be what our nature is. And so by and I'm not saying we should remove birth control either, but by having these things that change the entire dynamic between how we have sex, that don't align with our nature, it seems that we're also destroying to some degree our ability to actually be happy and be successful and be fulfilled, because we're being tricked by a society that doesn't understand what our nature is. Like, how many people understand any degree? And, you and me, I'm not saying that we're experts by any level of the imagination. How many of people even know the minute amount of evolutionary psychology that we've discussed today? Like, in fact, the funny part about it is it feels so intuitive, and it feels like it was intuitive for so long, but it's almost like our intuition is like, it's being pressed the opposite way. It's like, well, you think there's differences between men and women? Okay, well, you're bad. Like, no, like, men and women don't function differently. They can function the same. No, we can't function the same. We have different neurotransmitters. We have different hormones. We have different roles that have been played out because of the fact that we are animals. We have evolved to fit roles, but it's not men here and women here, or women here and men here. We are collaborative animals. We women, in my opinion, to be the best man you can possibly be, you need a good woman beside you. And to be the best woman you can possibly be, you need a strong, or like a stable man beside you. We just fit different roles, and it's that I think this is where the basketball analogy fits in. If I'm a rebounder and you're a scorer, you benefit as a scorer from me rebounding in the best way that I can. And as a rebounder, I benefit from you scoring, because my rebounding is assisting us win the game. And so it's just, if we're trying to win the game here, we both suit the role. And yeah, like, the scoring role sometimes might seem like a more important role, a more, flashy, cool role.
More glamorized, yeah.
Exactly, but ultimately, if I decide that I'm just not gonna rebound, you can't get the ball, you can't score, and we lose the game. And so, instead of having this weird gender war where it's like you have the red pill sphere and then, like, the pink pill and, like, whatever they all are, and incels and all this different thing where it's like it's almost like two different teams going against each other. No, we are all on the same team going to the same goal, which is ultimately, at the most broad thing, to promote our genes, and on a more, like, personal level, be happy and be fulfilled. And instead of trying to adjust all of these random things in our nature, we just need to follow it a little bit more intently and communicate a little bit more effectively about the differences between men and women, so that we understand the differences. Because if I understand the differences in women, I understand how to navigate the fact that we think differently. The same goes for women to men. Like, We just need to do a better job of actually understanding what we are as human beings instead of this weird, like what we should be as a society.
Rather than living in this post-modernist world where there is nothing that we can agree on and everything is completely and utterly subjective, we need to identify the things that are clearly apparent, that are the differences between the two most biological things within humans. And if we're able to identify these things and use them to our advantage, we can put our society in the best place possible to have overall well-being, because people are going to be fulfilled and happy, as you're saying, fitting the role that they're built to do. Um,
Exactly.
and I think that's just a beautiful way to end it, fellas. I think fellas and well, I guess was fellas like automatically men? I feel like that goes both ways.
Like I interpret it as just like people, but I think fellas is definitely a dude.
It's too grungy where I can't. That doesn't include
Like I
women,
can never
so
like if I call a girl a fella, it's like purposefully to be like just a
it's like
gimmick.
ironic.
Yeah.
Yeah. So well, people who watch this, the 10 people who watch this, we hope y'all got something out of it.
Man. Oh, dude, you
Stay
think we're close?
monogamous.
I don't think we're getting 10 views on this one.
I think we're getting 12,
Ooh.
and they're all gonna be me.
All right, so I'm gonna go piss real quick because I've been holding in for like, dude, I've been holding this one for like 30 minutes.
Okay, wait. I'm just gonna hang up or stop the recording and call you.
Okay, that works. I'll call you whenever I'm done pissing.
Okay, I do that.
Peace.
See ya.